A decorated officer on a solemn mission, a promise made to a fallen brother, and an airport that became a battlefield of prejudice and injustice. Colonel Ethan Carter faced not just delays and bureaucracy, but the kind of deep-seated bias that no uniform or medal could shield him from. What started as a journey of honor turned into a fight for dignity, respect, and justice, not just for one soldier, but for all. This is a story of resilience in the face of adversity, of how one man turned obstacles into stepping stones, and how a promise to a friend became a rallying cry for change. Before we dive into the compelling story of Colonel Ethan Carter's journey to bring his brother-in-arms home, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you're inspired by this tale of courage and perseverance, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next powerful story. Colonel Ethan Carter stepped out of the taxi, his polished shoes making a quiet click against the concrete as he steadied himself. The weight of his mission bore down on his broad shoulders, a mix of responsibility and loss. Around him, the usual chaos of the airport thrived. Engines rumbled, luggage wheels scraped the pavement, and passengers bustled about, each absorbed in their destinations. Despite the bright afternoon sun, Ethan's thoughts were clouded by a somber purpose. In his hand, he held the documents that authorized the transportation of a military casket. The name on those papers belonged to Private First Class Daniel Harris, a loyal friend, a fellow soldier, and a man Ethan considered family. Daniel wasn't just another soldier in uniform. He was someone Ethan had shared meals, laughter, and the grim realities of the battlefield with. Daniel had been lost in a surprise attack overseas, and Ethan had made a solemn promise. He would personally escort his brother-in-arms back to his hometown. No obstacle, no challenge would stop Ethan from fulfilling this vow. As he approached the terminal entrance, Ethan adjusted his crisp dress uniform. The numerous medals pinned to his chest gleamed under the sunlight, but they felt heavier than usual. Each medal symbolized a story of courage and survival, yet today they seemed to echo the silence of his loss rather than pride. Inside the airport, the atmosphere shifted. The scent of jet fuel mixed with the aroma of coffee from nearby kiosks and overhead monitors flashed flight schedules. Travelers hurried past, some sneaking a glance at Ethan in his uniform but offering no acknowledgement. He wasn't surprised. Gratitude wasn't something he expected. It was something he gave. At the check-in counter, a young woman with a tightly tied bun and a professional demeanor greeted him with a forced smile. "Ticket and ID, please," she said, her voice polite but mechanical. Ethan handed over the required documents, including his military ID. "I'm here to transport a military casket," he explained with measured calm. "Private First Class Daniel Harris. The arrangements have been made." The woman's smile faded slightly as her eyes scanned the paperwork. She glanced up at Ethan, her gaze subtly guarded, as if searching for a reason to doubt him. "You're the officer in charge?" she asked, her tone tinged with disbelief. "Yes," Ethan replied, his voice steady, though the question stung. The woman returned the documents but frowned. "One moment, sir. I need to check something." She leaned toward her colleague, whispering in a tone Ethan couldn't decipher, though he knew suspicion when he saw it. Moments like this weren't new to him. They were a recurring reminder of how people often judged him not for the uniform he wore, but for the color of his skin. Ethan clasped his hands behind his back and waited. Minutes passed, and he could feel the weight of glances from both the passengers around him and the staff at the counter. He focused on one thought: the promise he had made to Daniel. After what felt like an eternity, a middle-aged man in a suit, clearly a manager, approached. His stiff posture and stern expression immediately set the tone. "Colonel Carter, is it?" the man asked, looking at the papers Ethan held as though doubting their authenticity. "We need to perform a routine verification." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Everything is in order. I need to board my flight as soon as possible. The family is expecting their son." The man glanced at Ethan's medals, but offered no acknowledgement of their significance. "Let me see your ID again," he said curtly. Ethan handed over the ID without protest, though the deliberate slowness of the inspection felt like an insult. He watched the man examine it as if it were counterfeit. Finally, the man handed it back with a shrug. "It looks fine, but I'm calling security. Just a precaution." Security? Ethan's voice betrayed his disbelief. Policy, the manager replied with a thin smile that barely concealed condescension. Within moments, 2 security officers arrived. They moved with calculated authority, their expressions rigid and unwelcoming. "What's the issue here?" one of them asked, his arms crossed as he assessed Ethan with a hard stare. "This gentleman claims to be a colonel escorting a military casket," the manager explained. The officer's gaze lingered on Ethan's uniform before he finally said, "I'll need to see your papers." Ethan handed over the documents once more, his voice measured as he said, "Everything is here. This is an official military transport." The officer flipped through the paperwork, his face unreadable. "Looks official," he finally said, though his tone suggested reluctance. "But we'll need to take you to secondary screening. Standard procedure." Ethan's stomach sank. He knew this wasn't about protocol, it was about power and control. "Fine," he said, swallowing his frustration. As they led him away, past curious passengers and murmuring staff, Ethan kept his back straight. The promise he had made to Daniel echoed in his mind. No matter what, he would get him home. Ethan Carter walked through the terminal with 2 security officers flanking him, their stiff postures a stark contrast to the casual flow of travelers around them. The murmur of onlookers followed in their wake, whispers of curiosity and judgment mixing with the hum of the airport. Ethan's military bearing never faltered, even as anger simmered beneath the surface. They led him to a small, windowless room tucked away from the main terminal. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh glow on the metal table in the center. "Place your belongings on the table," one of the officers ordered, his tone devoid of warmth. Ethan complied without hesitation. He unclipped the medals from his chest and set them down, their weight a bitter reminder of the sacrifices they represented. Beside them, he placed his folded American flag, a sacred symbol of the friend he was escorting home. Lastly, he laid down a small dog tag, a token given to him by Daniel's wife, engraved with her husband's name and service number. The officers began their search, methodical and indifferent, their hands moving over his belongings as though they were inspecting contraband. They unfolded the flag, handling it with a carelessness that made Ethan's jaw tighten. "That's enough," he said firmly, his voice calm but unyielding. The younger officer, a wiry man with an air of arrogance, glanced up with a smirk. "We'll decide when it's enough." The search continued. They patted Ethan down, their hands lingering unnecessarily on the seams of his uniform. When they reached his medals, the younger officer paused, holding one of the highest distinctions up to the light. "So, these make you special, huh?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Ethan met his gaze, his expression a mask of calm. "Those represent sacrifices made for this country. They're not just decorations." The officer scoffed, placing the medal back on the table without a word. The older officer, a stocky man with a shaved head, muttered under his breath, "He thinks he's above the rules." Ethan exhaled slowly, his fists clenching briefly before he released them. He had faced worse on the battlefield, but this wouldn't break him. "Hands on the table," the younger officer snapped, his tone sharper than before. Ethan obeyed, spreading his hands flat against the cold surface. The officers continued their search, circling him like wolves. It was no longer about security. It was about humiliation. "Spread your legs," the older officer commanded. Ethan's expression didn't waver as he followed the instruction, though the indignity of the moment pressed heavily on him. He reminded himself of the promise he had made. Nothing would stop him from getting Daniel home. As the search dragged on, the door swung open abruptly. A commanding voice broke through the tense atmosphere. "Is there a problem here?" All heads turned to see an older man standing in the doorway. Though dressed in civilian clothes, his military bearing was unmistakable. His presence filled the room with an air of authority. The officers straightened instinctively, their earlier bravado shrinking under the weight of the newcomer's gaze. "This is Colonel Ethan Carter," the man said, his tone sharp. "I served with him overseas. What exactly do you think you're doing?" The older officer cleared his throat awkwardly. "Routine security check, sir. Nothing to worry about." The man's eyes narrowed. "Harassing a decorated officer isn't routine. I'll be speaking with your supervisor about this." Ethan recognized the man now, Andrew Mason, a retired lieutenant colonel who had fought beside him during one of their toughest deployments. Relief washed over him, but he kept his composure. "Good to see you, Colonel," Mason said, stepping into the room and offering his hand. Ethan accepted the handshake, his grip firm. "Thank you, Andrew. Your timing is impeccable." Mason turned back to the officers, his expression hard. "This ends now. Release him." The younger officer hesitated, glancing at his colleague for direction. The older officer gave a reluctant nod, stepping back and gesturing toward the door. "You're free to go, Colonel." Ethan gathered his belongings with deliberate care, reattaching his medals and folding the flag with precise movements. The dog tag went back into his pocket, its presence grounding him. Without another word to the officers, Ethan straightened his uniform and walked out of the room with Mason at his side. Back in the terminal, the atmosphere felt different. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier confrontation whispered among themselves, their gazes following Ethan as he passed. Mason clapped him on the shoulder as they walked. "They still don't make it easy for us, do they?" "No, they don't," Ethan replied, his voice low. "But you hang in there," Mason said, his tone softer. "Harris is waiting." Ethan nodded, the knot in his chest easing slightly. His determination burned brighter. As they approached the gate, Ethan's heart sank. The departure board flashed in bold red letters, "Delayed." Another obstacle. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, inhaling deeply to steady himself. He had come too far to let this stop him now. Adjusting his hat, he strode toward the airline desk, ready to face whatever challenge came next. Ethan Carter stood before the airline desk, his composure as rigid as his uniform. The bold red letters spelling "delayed" on the departure board felt like a personal affront. Each passing minute in the airport was another moment stolen from his mission, another delay in honoring his promise to bring Daniel home. The airline attendant at the desk, a young woman engrossed in her tablet, barely glanced up when he approached. Her indifference stung, but Ethan held his ground. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Can you tell me more about the delay for Flight 378? The woman sighed as though the question were a burden. "All flights are delayed, sir," she replied without looking up. "You'll just have to wait like everyone else." Ethan pressed his lips together, his patience wearing thin. "I'm not just waiting for a flight. I'm transporting a military casket. There are specific protocols in place for this kind of mission. Asaf, can you at least confirm the updated departure time?" The attendant finally looked at him, her expression flat. "Look," she said with an exaggerated sigh, "we're short-staffed and I don't have any new updates. Maybe check with the cargo team if it's that important." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Give me the number for the cargo team," he said evenly. With another sigh, the attendant tapped her tablet and scribbled a number on a sticky note. She slid it across the counter without a word, then turned her attention back to her screen. Ethan took the note and walked toward the nearest phone station, his pulse quickening with frustration. Dialing the number, he waited as the line rang several times before someone answered. "Cargo Services," a gruff voice finally said. "This is Colonel Ethan Carter," he began, his tone professional but firm. "I'm transporting a military casket on Flight 378. I need confirmation that the cargo is being handled properly." The voice on the other end let out a dismissive grunt. Yeah, we know about the casket. It's a busy day down here. We'll get to it when we get to it." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "This isn't acceptable," he said, his voice steady despite the frustration bubbling beneath. "I need to ensure the casket is handled with care and transferred properly. Unless you want to come down here yourself." The cargo worker replied, his tone laced with annoyance. "There's nothing more I can tell you." Ethan closed his eyes, summoning every ounce of patience he had left. "Then tell me how to get to the cargo area." The worker hesitated for a moment before relenting. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll give you the directions." Minutes later, Ethan approached the entrance to the restricted cargo area. A burly security guard stood by the gate, arms folded across his chest. He eyed Ethan suspiciously as he approached. "You can't be here," the guard said flatly. Ethan presented his military ID and explained the situation. "I'm here for a military casket. I need to ensure it's being properly handled." The guard barely glanced at the ID before shaking his head. "Rules are rules," You can't just waltz in here. Ethan's jaw tightened. I have authorization. This isn't optional. The guard leaned closer, a sneer curling his lips. Maybe next time, bring someone who looks the part. The insult hung in the air like a slap. Ethan didn't flinch, but his fists clenched at his sides. His voice remained calm, though the weight of the words carried years of restraint. Get your supervisor, Ethan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The guard glared at him for a long moment, clearly debating whether to escalate the situation. Finally, he muttered into his radio, Got someone here who thinks he's important. Ethan waited in tense silence, his resolve unshaken. Daniel's dog tag in his pocket felt heavier by the second, a reminder of the promise he had made. After several agonizing minutes, the supervisor arrived. He was an older man with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. What's the issue? He asked, glancing between Ethan and the guard. Ethan explained the situation with military precision, detailing his mission and the necessary precautions required for transporting the casket. The supervisor listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Ethan finished, the man gave a slow nod. All right, he said. I'll let you through, but I can't have you disrupting our operations. I'll stay out of the way, Ethan assured him. I just need to confirm that everything is in order. The supervisor unlocked the gate and motioned for Ethan to enter. The cargo area was a hive of activity, filled with the hum of machinery and the clatter of forklifts. Amid the organized chaos, Ethan's eyes locked on the casket draped in the American flag, resting on a steel platform. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. Nearby, a worker complained loudly to his colleague. Can't believe we have to haul this thing around like it's something special. Just another piece of cargo, if you ask me. Ethan's hands curled into fists, but he took a steadying breath. Confronting them wouldn't serve Daniel's memory. Instead, he walked to the casket, straightened the edges of the flag with deliberate care, and whispered under his breath, I've got you, brother, almost there. For a brief moment, the world around him faded, and the weight of his mission felt lighter. But the moment was interrupted by a sharp voice. Hey, you can't touch that, one of the workers shouted, approaching him with a scowl. Ethan turned to face the man, his gaze unwavering. I'm Colonel Ethan Carter, he said, his tone firm but calm. This is my mission. Do you have a problem with that? The worker opened his mouth to argue, but froze when he saw the fire in Ethan's eyes. Muttering something under his breath, he walked away, leaving Ethan alone with the casket once more. With the cargo properly secured and the necessary forms double-checked, Ethan made his way back to the terminal. His phone buzzed just as he reached the gate, and there was a notification from the airline. Ethan exhaled through his nose, frustration bubbling to the surface. He sank into a chair at the gate, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. The obstacles were piling up, one after another, testing his patience and resolve. But he reminded himself, this wasn't just about the journey. It was about the promise. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes on the flashing delayed sign. Whatever roadblocks lay ahead, he wasn't stopping now. The hours dragged on in the crowded airport terminal. Passengers sprawled across chairs and floors, frustration simmering in the stale air. Ethan Carter sat in silence, his back straight, his hands clasped in his lap. The ticking of the clock in his mind was deafening, a constant reminder that every second delayed was another stolen from Daniel's grieving family. He pulled out the dog tag from his pocket, running his thumb over Daniel's name etched into the metal. It grounded him, a tangible reminder of his promise. We'll get there, he murmured softly, more to himself than to anyone else. Suddenly, a commotion behind him broke his thoughts. Ethan turned slightly, his sharp senses catching murmurs from a group gathering near the airline desk. Is that the guy? Someone whispered. The colonel they were hassling earlier? Phones were out, recording. Ethan didn't react at first. He was no stranger to standing out in public, especially in uniform, but this time the attention felt different. They searched him like he was a criminal, another voice said, louder than the rest. A middle-aged man with a sleek tablet stepped forward. Sir, he said, addressing Ethan, are you okay? We saw what happened with security. Ethan met the man's gaze with a nod. I'm fine, he replied evenly. You don't look fine, the man pressed, his brow furrowing. They treated you like a suspect, not a soldier. That's not right." Before Ethan could respond, another voice chimed in from the growing crowd. "I recorded the whole thing. They had no reason to search you like that." Ethan shifted uncomfortably as more passengers joined in, their voices rising in frustration. Phones pointed at him from all directions, capturing every nuance of his expression. "If they can do this to him," someone muttered, "what chance do the rest of us have?" The murmurs spread like wildfire, building into a cacophony of discontent. Ethan stood, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside him. He knew better than to feed into the chaos, but it was clear the situation was slipping out of his control. By the time Ethan reached the gate again, the airport's social media channels were ablaze. Videos of his confrontation with security were spreading rapidly, accompanied by hashtags like "Respect Our Heroes" and "Justice for Carter." Clips showed him standing stoically as security officers searched him with unnecessary force, their disrespect glaringly obvious. Ethan's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Strangers expressed their outrage and support, denouncing the treatment he had endured. Messages flooded in. "This is unacceptable. Our heroes deserve better." "Racial profiling, even in uniform. Disgusting." "Colonel Carter, we stand with you." The situation escalated quickly. Protesters began gathering outside the airport within hours, armed with signs that read, "Honor our soldiers," and "Equal treatment now." Their chants, "Respect our soldiers," echoed through the terminal walls. Inside, the tension among airline staff and security was palpable. Managers held hurried meetings behind closed doors, their faces drawn with concern. Flight delays compounded the unrest, and the growing crowd outside only intensified the mounting pressure. Ethan sat quietly, observing the chaos around him. He wasn't seeking attention. His only focus was getting Daniel home. Yet he couldn't ignore the storm that had formed around his personal mission. Bookmark. Go back. Within the hour, reporters arrived at the gate, armed with cameras and microphones. Ethan had anticipated this. The videos circulating online had turned his story into a national spectacle, and the media wasn't about to miss the chance to capitalize on it. "Colonel Carter," one reporter called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "Can you comment on the treatment you received from airport security?" Another shoved a microphone closer. "Do you believe this reflects systemic discrimination against black servicemen?" Ethan kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened. He knew the media's power to twist words, and he refused to let them steer the narrative. "No comment," he said firmly, folding his arms across his chest. "Colonel, please," another journalist pressed. "The public wants to know. What do you have to say about this incident?" Ethan exhaled slowly, his restraint unwavering. "No comment," he repeated. The questions continued relentlessly and probing. A woman with a determined expression stepped forward. "How do you feel, knowing you were treated this way while on a mission to transport your friend's remains?" That question cut deep. Ethan clenched his jaw, the emotions he had been holding back threatening to surface. He closed his eyes briefly, regaining his composure. When he opened them, his voice was calm but cold. "No comment." While Ethan tried to distance himself from the media frenzy, the situation outside the terminal continued to escalate. The clips of his mistreatment had gone viral, drawing national attention. Protests gained momentum, fueled by anger over both racial profiling and the disrespect shown to a decorated officer. Signs waved in the air, and voices chanted in unison. Inside the terminal, passengers pressed their faces against the windows to watch the growing crowd. The message was clear. The public demanded accountability. The airport management scrambled to contain the fallout. A hastily written statement was released. "We are reviewing the events involving Colonel Ethan Carter and will ensure all military personnel are treated with the utmost respect." But the public wasn't satisfied. Social media users labeled the response as hollow and demanded concrete action. As reporters hovered nearby, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his exhaustion evident. The world had turned his personal mission into a public spectacle, and yet all he wanted was to complete his promise to Daniel. A protester's chant filtered faintly through the walls. "Respect our soldiers." Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. His resolve, however, remained unshaken. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about something much larger. A fight he hadn't intended to lead but couldn't walk away from. As the protests outside the airport grew louder, the tension inside the terminal reached a boiling point. Airline staff huddled nervously behind their counters, passengers whispered among themselves, and the reporters circling Ethan Carter only seemed to increase in number. Ethan remained seated, his expression unreadable as he monitored the situation. He wasn't here to make a statement or to incite a movement. He was here to bring Daniel home. Yet, the growing public outrage and the ripple effects of his mistreatment had turned his mission into a spotlight for broader issues. Suddenly, Ethan's phone buzzed. He glanced down to see an incoming call from a name he hadn't expected to see: General Alexander Hayes. Ethan sat up straighter and answered. "General Hayes, sir," he said, his tone sharp with respect. "Colonel Carter," came the deep, authoritative voice on the other end. "I've been briefed on the situation. What in the world is going on over there?" Ethan hesitated, weighing his words carefully. "It's been complicated, sir," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. "I'll bet," Hayes said grimly. "Listen, Carter, we're not letting this slide. I'm already pulling strings. Give me a little time to get things moving." "Yes, sir. Thank you," Ethan said, relief creeping into his voice. "Stay strong, Colonel," Hayes added. "We've got your six." The call ended, leaving Ethan with a flicker of hope amid the chaos. The general was known for his no-nonsense leadership and his fierce loyalty to his men. If anyone could cut through the bureaucracy, it was him. Minutes after the call, the shift in the airport's atmosphere was palpable. Airline staff suddenly became more attentive, their previously indifferent expressions now tinged with nervousness. A senior airline representative approached Ethan, his face pale and his hands clasped tightly. "Colonel Carter," the man began, his tone tentative, "we deeply regret the inconvenience you've experienced today. Please allow us to upgrade your flight and offer you access to our VIP lounge." Ethan met the man's gaze with calm intensity. "I don't need an upgrade," he said firmly. "I need my flight to depart on time, and I need to ensure the casket is handled with respect." The representative hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Ethan's refusal. "Of course, sir. We're doing everything we can to expedite the process," he stammered. Ethan nodded curtly, dismissing the man's attempt at appeasement. He wasn't interested in apologies or empty gestures. His focus remained on the promise he had made to Daniel. As Ethan settled back into his seat near the gate, another familiar figure entered the terminal. It was Lieutenant Colonel William Turner. A retired officer Ethan had served with during a critical overseas operation years ago. Turner's silver hair and commanding presence immediately drew attention as he strode purposefully toward Ethan. "Carter," Turner said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Heard they were giving you trouble." Ethan allowed himself a faint smile. "It's been a day." Turner's expression hardened, a flicker of anger flashing in his eyes. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "A decorated officer on an honorable mission, and this is how they treat you?" Ethan said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Turner turned his gaze toward the airline staff, who lingered nearby, nervously watching the exchange. "You'll regret every second of this when we're done," Turner said sharply, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. The staff shrank under his stern gaze. Without missing a beat, Turner pulled out his phone and began making calls, rallying other officers and military officials to put pressure on the airport's management. Not long after, Ethan received a text message from General Hayes. "I've contacted the airline's CEO. They're fast-tracking your flight. Hang tight." Though Ethan appreciated the growing support, his resolve remained steady. His mission wasn't about receiving favors or being fast-tracked. It was about honoring a fallen brother. The protests outside continued to grow, their chants echoing faintly through the terminal walls. Ethan's mind wandered briefly to the people holding signs and raising their voices. He hadn't asked for their support, but their solidarity was unmistakable. A short while later, a new figure approached Ethan. This time, it was a representative from the airline's corporate office, his crisp suit and nervous smile betraying the gravity of the situation. "Colonel Carter," the man began, extending a hand. Ethan shook it briefly, his expression neutral. "First, let me personally apologize for everything you've experienced today," the representative said, his tone overly rehearsed. "This is not how we conduct business, and we deeply regret any offense caused." Ethan's silence was heavy. the weight of his gaze enough to make the man shift uncomfortably. "We've arranged for everything," the representative continued quickly. "Your flight is ready for priority boarding, and the casket will be handled with the utmost care. Please accept our sincerest apologies." Ethan gave a slow nod, his voice steady as he replied, "All I want is to get my friend home. That's it." The man exhaled in visible relief, nodding in agreement. "Of course, Colonel. The flight crew is standing by, and we'll ensure everything goes smoothly from here." As the gate opened for priority boarding, Ethan rose from his seat. Turner walked beside him, his presence a quiet show of support. "They're scrambling now," Turner said with a faint smirk. "But you made your point. You've got people watching your back." Ethan allowed himself a brief smile. "I didn't ask for all this." "I know," Turner replied, his tone firm. "But sometimes the right battles find you." Ethan nodded, his mind briefly flickering to Daniel. The promise he had made to his friend was now intertwined with a larger fight, one he hadn't anticipated but wouldn't shy away from. As he approached the boarding gate, Ethan caught a glimpse of the protesters outside through the airport's large windows. Their signs and chants carried a powerful message, one that resonated deeply with him. He turned to the gate agent, who gave him a nervous smile. "The flight is ready when you are, Colonel." Ethan nodded once. "Let's get moving." With Turner at his side and Daniel's memory guiding him, Ethan stepped forward, one step closer to home, one step closer to keeping his promise. The plane touched down just as the first light of dawn painted the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. Ethan Carter stared out the window, his eyes tracing the distant horizon. Though the journey had been exhausting, his posture remained disciplined, his focus sharp. This was the final step, the most important part of his mission. As the plane taxied to a halt, Ethan rose from his seat, his movements precise and deliberate. The cabin crew, now fully briefed on the significance of his presence, handled his requests with quiet deference. On the tarmac, a military transport vehicle waited. Ethan watched as the casket, draped in the American flag, was carefully unloaded. He stepped off the plane and onto the runway, his gaze fixed on the casket as it was transferred. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. He approached the casket, straightening the flag one last time, his fingers smoothing every crease with reverence. "We're here, Daniel," he whispered. "We made it." At the gates of the small-town cemetery, Daniel Harris's family awaited, their faces etched with grief. Ethan's sharp military instincts softened as he took in the scene. Daniel's mother stood at the forefront, clutching a worn photograph of her son in uniform. Her trembling hands spoke of a sorrow too deep for words. Ethan stepped forward, his polished boots crunching softly on the gravel path. Daniel's father, an older man with silver hair and tired eyes, approached first. He extended a hand, his grip firm but trembling. "Colonel Carter," the man said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for bringing him home." Ethan shook the man's hand firmly but gently. "It was my honor, sir. Daniel was my brother in every way that mattered." Daniel's mother stepped closer, her tear-streaked face lifted to meet Ethan's gaze. "He always spoke so highly of you," she whispered. "He said if anything ever happened to him, you'd bring him back to us." Ethan swallowed hard, the knot in his throat nearly unbearable. "I promised him, ma'am," he said quietly, "and I don't break my promises." The family nodded, their gratitude mixing with their sorrow. They gestured for Ethan to join the procession, which had formed to lead Daniel to his final resting place. The cemetery was quiet, the air heavy with reverence. Rows of American flags lined the path to the plot reserved for Daniel. Soldiers in dress uniforms stood at attention, their rifles slung over their shoulders. Local residents had gathered as well, forming a silent crowd. Some held small flags, others wiped tears from their eyes. Word of Ethan's journey had spread, and the community had come together to honor both Daniel's sacrifice and Ethan's determination. The casket was carried forward as the somber notes of taps began to play, the mournful melody echoing through the trees. Ethan marched beside the casket, his steps measured and deliberate, every movement precise. When they reached the gravesite, Ethan stood at attention beside the casket, his hand raised in a crisp salute. The folded flag from the casket was handed to Daniel's mother, her hands trembling as she clutched it to her chest. As the casket was lowered into the ground, Ethan remained standing, his salute unwavering. The weight of his promise to Daniel settled deeply within him. He had fulfilled his duty, but the reality of saying goodbye was a wound that cut deeply. When the ceremony ended, Ethan stepped forward to deliver a final message. His voice was steady, though each word carried the weight of memories, battles, and loss. Private First Class Daniel Harris was more than just a soldier, Ethan began. He was a friend, a brother, and a man of unwavering honor. On the battlefield, we relied on each other in ways only soldiers can understand. Daniel saved my life more times than I can count, and when he fell, I swore I would bring him home. Ethan paused, his gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. Daniel didn't care about the color of my skin or the medals on my chest. He cared about the man standing beside him. That's the way it should always be. For a moment, the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. Ethan lowered his hand from his salute and stepped back, allowing Daniel's family to place flowers on the casket. As the family and community members began to disperse, several townspeople approached Ethan, their expressions a mix of gratitude and indignation. "We heard what they did to you at the airport," one man said, shaking his head. "It's not right. We won't forget it." Another woman, her eyes red from crying, added, "You brought him home, Colonel. That means everything to us. Thank you." Ethan nodded, his somber expression softening briefly. Their words weren't the recognition he sought, but they were a reminder that his journey had resonated far beyond his personal mission. Later that evening, Ethan joined Daniel's family at a small gathering in their home. It was a quiet affair, filled with close friends and relatives who reminisced about Daniel's life. They shared stories, laughed through their tears, and found comfort in one another. At one point, Daniel's mother pulled Ethan aside, pressing a folded letter into his hand. "Daniel wrote this for you before he left," she whispered. "He wanted you to have it, in case." Ethan unfolded the letter with trembling hands. The handwriting was familiar, the words short but powerful. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means you kept your promise. Thank you for getting me home, brother. I'll see you on the other side." The words hit Ethan harder than any battlefield wound. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket alongside Daniel's dog tag. "I'll see you on the other side, Daniel," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. That night, as the gathering drew to a close, the family raised a quiet toast in Daniel's memory. Ethan lifted his glass, his heart heavy but his spirit resolute. Despite the obstacles, he had fulfilled his promise. He had brought his brother home. The next morning, Ethan Carter woke early, the first rays of sunlight streaming through the window of the small guest room where he had stayed. His body felt heavy with exhaustion, but his mind was clear. The mission was complete. Daniel Harris was home, resting where he belonged. Yet the events leading up to this moment still weighed on him. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, Daniel's dog tag in his hand. It was a small piece of metal, but it held immense significance. He had faced countless challenges to fulfill his promise, but what lingered now wasn't just the satisfaction of a completed mission. It was a stark reminder of the systemic barriers he had confronted along the way. Ethan's thoughts returned to the indignity of the security checks, the dismissive attitudes, and the blatant discrimination he had faced. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, deeper problem. Even as a decorated officer with medals on his chest, he was seen first and foremost as a black man in a society that too often judged him by his appearance rather than his character. The fight wasn't over. Later that morning, Ethan's phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications. News of the incident at the airport had spread far beyond social media. Major news outlets were running stories on the events, and the protests outside the airport had grown into a national movement. Ethan scrolled through the flood of messages in his inbox. Soldiers, officers, and veterans from all walks of life had written to him. Some expressed their disgust at how he had been treated, while others shared their own stories of facing discrimination in the military. One message from a younger soldier stood out. "Sir, I've experienced what you went through too many times. Seeing you stand tall gives me hope that things can change." Ethan exhaled deeply. It was clear now what had happened to him wasn't an isolated case. It was a reflection of a larger systemic issue that needed to be addressed. Among the messages was one from General Hayes. The inquiry is officially underway. This won't be swept under the rug. Expect follow-up soon. Ethan appreciated the action being taken, but he knew that inquiries and investigations were just the beginning. Real change requires more than just words and reports. Determined to act, Ethan made a series of calls. His first stop was the local Veterans Center, where he met with a group of former soldiers and community leaders. Together, they began organizing a campaign, not just for justice in his case, but for systemic reforms to ensure no soldier would face the same indignities he had endured. At the meeting, Ethan addressed the group with his characteristic calm but commanding presence. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. "It's about every soldier who has ever been disrespected or disregarded because of how they look. It's about ensuring that the sacrifices we make in service to this country are honored, not ignored." The room nodded in agreement, their expressions a mix of determination and hope. Ideas flowed freely, including petitions, public campaigns, and outreach to policymakers. One of the veterans, an older woman named Patricia Moore, spoke up. "Colonel, we've all seen it. The bias, the disregard. But this, what you went through, might be the moment we can push for real change." Ethan nodded, her words echoing his own thoughts. "We need accountability," he said firmly. "Not just from the airport staff, but from the military itself. This fight doesn't end with me. It starts with me." Within days, the campaign gained momentum. Social media movements like Justice for Carter and Respect All Soldiers began trending nationwide. Public figures and activists lent their voices to the cause, amplifying the call for change. Protests outside the airport grew larger, with hundreds joining the movement. Signs bearing messages like "End racial profiling" and "Honor all soldiers" filled the streets. The public's demand for accountability became impossible to ignore. The airport's management, under intense pressure, launched an internal investigation. Several employees involved in Ethan's mistreatment were placed on leave, and the head of airport security resigned. Meanwhile, the airline issued a public apology. "We deeply regret the treatment Colonel Carter experienced and are committed to implementing changes to ensure such incidents do not happen again." For many, the apology rang hollow. However, for Ethan, it was a small step in the right direction. The military also began to respond to the growing outcry. General Hayes publicly acknowledged the need for reforms, announcing a new initiative to address racial bias within the ranks. Ethan was invited to participate in shaping the program, lending his voice and experience to the effort. During a conversation with General Hayes, Ethan expressed his thoughts candidly. "It's not going to be easy," he said. "No," Hayes replied with a small smile. "But necessary battles rarely are. And we need people like you leading the charge." Ethan nodded. "I've faced tougher battles." "That's exactly what I was counting on," Hayes said. As the campaign continued to gain traction, Ethan found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't intended to lead. He had started this journey to honor a promise to his friend, but it had grown into something much larger. Weeks later, Ethan received a letter from Daniel's family. Written in Mrs. Harris's neat handwriting, it read, "Ethan, thank you for bringing our boy home. Your dedication meant the world to us. But more than that, thank you for standing up when it would have been easier to stay silent. Daniel would be proud of you. We all are." Ethan read the letter twice, his heart heavy with emotion. He folded it carefully and placed it alongside Daniel's dog tag, a reminder of the bond they shared and the promise he had kept. In the quiet moments that followed, Ethan reflected on the journey he had undertaken. It had been a long road filled with obstacles and injustices, yet through it all, he had stood firm. The fight for justice wasn't over, but for the first time, Ethan felt that progress was within reach. He had brought Daniel home with honor, and along the way, he had ignited a movement that would resonate far beyond his own story. Standing by the window, Ethan gazed out at the horizon. A new day was dawning, full of challenges yet to come. But Ethan Carter was ready. "We're not done yet, Daniel," he whispered to himself. "Not by a long shot." With quiet determination, he stepped forward, prepared to face whatever battles lay ahead. Not just as a soldier, but as a leader, a brother, and a man of unbreakable resolve. Weeks after Ethan Carter's mission to bring Daniel Harris home had concluded, The ripple effects of his journey continued to spread across the country. His story, now a symbol of perseverance and justice, had resonated far beyond the confines of the airport terminal. The campaign for change that Ethan had inspired gained significant traction. Community leaders, veterans, and everyday citizens rallied around the cause, their voices unified in demanding accountability and reform. The hashtags Justice for Carter and Respect All Soldiers became synonymous with a larger movement to combat racial bias and systemic injustice in both civilian and military institutions. Ethan's role in the movement evolved naturally. Though he had never sought the spotlight, his presence became a rallying point for those seeking change. He balanced his commitment to the cause with his inherent humility, ensuring that the focus remained on the broader issues rather than on himself. At the urging of fellow advocates, Ethan agreed to speak at a public town hall organized by a coalition of military families and civil rights organizations. The event, held in a packed community center, was a pivotal moment for the campaign. Standing at the podium, Ethan scanned the crowd. Faces of all ages and backgrounds looked back at him, their expressions a mix of hope and determination. He took a deep breath before beginning. "When I stepped into that airport, my only goal was to bring my friend home," he started, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Private First Class Daniel Harris wasn't just a soldier. He was my brother in arms, a man of integrity and courage who saved my life more times than I can count." The audience sat in rapt attention as Ethan continued. "But along the way, I was reminded of something I've known for too long. The uniform we wear doesn't shield us from prejudice. Even as a decorated officer, I was judged not for my service but for the color of my skin. And that judgment is something too many of us face every day, in and out of uniform." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "This isn't just about me," Ethan said firmly. "This is about ensuring that no soldier, no person, has to endure the kind of indignity I experienced. It's about respect for the sacrifices we make, and respect for the humanity we all share." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. Change doesn't come easy. It takes voices, it takes action, and it takes a community willing to stand together. And I believe this community, this movement, has the power to make that change. The applause was thunderous, and a wave of support filled the room. Ethan stepped back from the podium, his heart heavy yet hopeful. The impact of Ethan's speech was immediate. The town hall garnered widespread media coverage, amplifying the campaign's message to a national audience. Public figures, including prominent veterans and activists, voiced their support, further legitimizing the movement. The military responded by accelerating its internal review process. General Hayes, who had been a steadfast ally, announced the launch of mandatory training programs aimed at addressing racial bias within the armed forces. He also established a task force, with Ethan invited to serve as a senior advisor. "Colonel Carter," Hayes said during a private meeting, "your voice is critical to this effort. We need leaders who've lived these experiences to help guide the change." Ethan accepted without hesitation. "If it means no one else has to go through what I did, I'm in," he replied. Meanwhile, the airport where Ethan's ordeal began faced continued scrutiny. Protesters maintained their presence outside the terminal for weeks, demanding meaningful reforms. Under mounting pressure, the airport's executive board released a comprehensive action plan that included updated anti-discrimination policies, staff training, and the creation of an oversight committee to handle similar incidents in the future. The airline involved also took steps to repair its reputation, though its initial response had been criticized as insufficient. In addition to firing the employees directly responsible for mishandling Ethan's case, the company pledged to collaborate with military organizations to improve how it handles service members and military transports. For Ethan, these changes were a step in the right direction, but he remained cautious. "Policies are only as good as the people enforcing them," he told a journalist during an interview. "The real test will be in how these promises are carried out." Despite the intense focus on his story, Ethan never lost sight of the mission that had started it all, honoring Daniel's memory. He visited Daniel's grave regularly, often bringing letters and mementos from fellow soldiers who had served alongside them. One day, As Ethan stood silently at the grave, he was joined by Daniel's father. The older man placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his grip firm with gratitude. "Ethan," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you didn't just bring my boy home. You gave us peace, and you've given so many others hope." Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. "He deserved no less," he said quietly. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan's life found a new rhythm. He balanced his duties as a military officer with his role as an advocate for systemic reform. The campaign he had helped spark showed no signs of slowing, with tangible progress being made in both civilian and military institutions. One morning, Ethan received a letter in the mail. The envelope bore the logo of a national veterans organization. Inside was an invitation to an awards ceremony recognizing individuals who had made significant contributions to the veteran community. The letter read, "Colonel Ethan Carter, your courage and dedication have inspired a nation. Your actions have not only honored the memory of your fallen brother, but have paved the way for meaningful change. It is our privilege to honor you." Ethan set the letter down, a mix of emotions washing over him. While he appreciated the recognition, he knew his work was far from done. On the day of the ceremony, Ethan stood before a crowd of veterans, military leaders, and advocates. As he accepted the award, he kept his remarks brief but powerful. "This award isn't just for me," he said. "It's for every soldier who has faced prejudice and disrespect. It's for the families who have lost loved ones, and for the communities fighting for justice. The fight isn't over, but together we're making progress." The applause that followed was heartfelt, a tribute to the man who had turned a personal mission into a national movement. That evening, as Ethan returned home, he placed the award next to the folded flag and Daniel's dog tag. Together, they served as a reminder of the promise he had kept and the journey he had undertaken. Ethan looked out the window, the horizon bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. Though the road ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure. He would keep fighting, not just for Daniel, but for every soldier who deserved respect, dignity, and honor. "We're still in this, Daniel," Ethan murmured, "and we're not stopping anytime soon." With that, he turned away from the window, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The story of Colonel Ethan Carter is more than just a tale of a soldier fulfilling a promise. It's a powerful reminder of resilience, dignity, and the unyielding spirit of those who fight for what is right. Ethan's journey to bring his friend, Private First Class Daniel Harris, home was not just about honoring a fallen brother in arms. Along the way, it uncovered a much deeper truth. Even those who serve their country with valor and sacrifice are not immune to prejudice and systemic failings. Ethan's perseverance in the face of disrespect and injustice speaks to the strength of character required to rise above adversity. His ability to channel personal pain into a broader fight for change offers a lesson to us all. Battles for justice and equality are fought not just on the battlefield, but in the everyday interactions that define our society. This story also highlights the importance of community. From the retired veterans who stood by Ethan's side to the protesters who rallied for accountability, it is clear that change requires collective action. The echoes of solidarity remind us that even small voices, when joined together, can create a movement that challenges norms and demands progress. Daniel's memory serves as the beacon guiding Ethan. But by the end, it is evident that this mission is about more than just one man. It was about respect for soldiers, for humanity, and for the shared values that bind us together. The story leaves us with a simple yet profound takeaway. Honoring promises is about more than fulfilling obligations. It's about standing up for what is right, even when it's hard. If this story moved you, let us know by commenting with the number 1. If it truly inspired you, comment with the number 2. And most importantly, share your own stories of resilience, sacrifice, and hope. We would love to hear them. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another powerful, inspiring story like this one. Your thoughts matter, so join the conversation in the comments below. Together, let's continue to share and celebrate the stories that remind us of the strength of humanity.